The sun hung high in the sky, its heat oppressive, the air thick with dust and the scent of dry earth. I had been walking for what felt like hours, the unyielding desert stretching before me in a never-ending sea of golden dunes. There was no shelter, no sign of life, just the burning sun and the cruel, endless sand. I had been out here to scout, to look for something, anything, that might offer me a sense of purpose in this desolate wasteland. It had been a long, hard journey, and my water supply was running low. I was about to turn back, resigning myself to the fact that I might not find what I was looking for, when something caught my eye in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a mirage, the heat making the air shimmer and distort. But as I took a few more steps, I realized that what I was seeing wasn't an illusion at all. A figure, small and fragile, lay half buried in the sand, barely visible against the harsh backdrop of the desert. I hurried towards her, heart racing. The sight of her, alone and abandoned, filled me with an instinctive panic. My legs carried me faster until I was kneeling beside her, my hands trembling as I gently touched her skin. She was burning up. The heat of the desert had taken its toll on her, and her body was covered in patches of raw, scorched skin. Her clothes, if you could even call them that, were little more than rags, torn and tattered by time and exposure. I could see the bloodstains, the bruises, the marks of someone who had been through unimaginable pain. She was half naked, her body exposed to the harsh elements, and yet there was something about her, something in her eyes, that made me pause. Her face was delicate, almost otherworldly. I had never seen anything like it before. Her skin was pale, but it had an unnatural shimmer, like the moonlight reflecting off water. Her eyes, though, were what truly captured me. They were wide with fear, but beneath the fear was something else, something deep, something ancient. A pain that ran so deep I could feel it in my own chest, as if it were a part of me. I swallowed, hard, fighting the urge to panic. I couldn't leave her here. She was on the brink of death, and I wasn't going to just walk away. Without thinking, I gently lifted her from the sand, cradling her against me. Her body was light, fragile, and her breathing was shallow, weak. "Stay with me," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if she could hear me. "You're going to be okay. I'm going to get you somewhere safe." She shivered violently in my arms, and I felt a pang of guilt. The desert was a cruel place, and I had no idea how long she had been out here, alone. I couldn't help but wonder who had left her like this, who had abandoned her to suffer in the scorching heat. She wasn't from Earth, there was no doubt about that. Her appearance was unlike anything I had ever seen before. She was different. Her hair, long and silver, shimmered in the sunlight, and her features were sharper, more refined than any human I had ever met. I glanced down at her again, and for the briefest moment I thought I saw something in her eyes. Recognition? Understanding? I couldn't be sure. But then, just as quickly, her eyes fluttered closed, and I knew she had fallen unconscious again. I moved quickly, trying to find shelter from the heat. There was a small outcrop of rocks in the distance, barely visible against the horizon, and I made my way toward it. Every step felt like a battle, the weight of her body growing heavier with each passing moment. But I couldn't stop. Not when she needed me. I reached the shelter of the rocks just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the temperature dropping slightly, but still unbearable. I laid her down gently on the ground, taking a moment to catch my breath. Sweat dripped down my face, and I wiped it away with the back of my hand. I had to focus. I couldn't let my exhaustion cloud my judgment. Not when she needed me. I fumbled through my pack, pulling out a small medical kit. I knew it wasn't enough to treat the extent of her injuries, but it was all I had. As I began to clean the cuts and abrasions on her skin, my mind raced. Who was she? What had happened to her? How had she ended up here, alone in the desert, suffering like this? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing: I couldn't just leave her here. I couldn't turn my back on her. not after what I had seen in her eyes. She was more than just a victim of circumstance. There was a strength in her, something that went beyond the physical. I could feel it even now as I worked to stabilize her. She wasn't just some helpless creature. No, she was something far more. I finished tending to her wounds as best I could, but there was little I could do to ease the emotional scars that marred her. It was clear to me now that whatever had happened to her, whoever had hurt her, had left deeper wounds than the ones I could see. She had been brutalized, used, abandoned, and it was the look in her eyes that told me everything, the emptiness, the resignation. She had suffered, and somehow I knew that it wasn't just the desert that had broken her. No, it was something far worse. I couldn't imagine what she had gone through, but I knew I would do whatever it took to help her heal, to give her a chance at survival, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at something more than just survival. Because she deserved more than that. She deserved to feel safe, to feel like she was more than just a victim. As night fell, I built a small fire to keep us warm, the flames dancing in the cold desert air. I sat beside her, watching her sleep, her breathing steady but shallow. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for her now. She wasn't alone anymore. I would make sure of that. She had been abandoned by her own kind, used by the very beings who should have protected her. But I wouldn't let her be abandoned again, not by me. I had no idea who had done this to her or why, but I was determined to find out. I would hunt down the ones responsible, and I would make them pay for what they had done to her. I didn't care what it took. She didn't deserve this. No one deserved this. As I sat by the fire, my mind racing with questions and plans, I looked down at the girl I had found in the desert. Her name was still a mystery, but I would learn it. I would learn everything about her, because she wasn't just some alien. She was a person who deserved kindness, a person who deserved to know that not all humans were like the ones who had hurt her. Her name would come, eventually. But for now, all I could do was protect her, keep her safe, and maybe, just maybe, I could help her find the strength to heal. Had no idea what the future held, but as I sat there in the dark, watching the fire flicker and the desert stretch endlessly before me, I knew one thing. I wasn't going anywhere. Not while she needed me. As the fire crackled, its orange glow flickering against the blackness of the night, I found myself lost in thought, staring at the girl lying in front of me. I couldn't help but notice how fragile she looked, like a doll that had been discarded, left to wither and break. Her silver hair, now tangled and matted from the desert's harsh grip, fell across her face, and her lips, dry and cracked, trembled slightly in her sleep. She was so still, so silent, that it felt as if the world around us had paused, holding its breath. I ran a hand through my own hair, trying to shake the exhaustion that weighed on me. The desert's heat had drained me, and I could feel the ache in my muscles, the tightness in my joints. But none of that mattered. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about her. The silence of the desert night was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind. The stars were bright above, scattered across the sky like tiny diamonds. But even their brilliance couldn't banish the darkness that hung heavy in my chest. There was a coldness here, a feeling of something lost. I wasn't sure if it was the desert itself, or if it was the weight of the girl's suffering, but the air felt thick with something I couldn't quite name. I glanced down at her again, my fingers lightly brushing the silver strands of hair from her face. Her skin was cool now, a welcome change from the unbearable heat she had endured. The fire crackled nearby, its warmth a small comfort in the vast emptiness of the desert. But still, she shivered. She had been so abused, so broken, that even the smallest thing, the smallest change in temperature, could make her tremble. And it broke my heart. I thought about what I had seen when I first found her, how she had been lying there, half buried in the sand, barely clinging to life. She had looked almost lifeless, as if her body had given up. I wondered how long she had been out here, alone, with no one to care for her, no one to protect her. The thought made my blood boil, but I pushed it down. Now was not the time for anger. Now was the time to focus, to think about what needed to be done next. I needed to get her back to civilization. There was a small settlement a few days' travel from here, and I could get her there, get her medical help. But even as I thought about it, I knew that this desert had a way of making everything more complicated. It wasn't just a matter of getting her to safety, it was a matter of figuring out who she was, where she came from, and who had done this to her. I had no idea what kind of creature she was. She wasn't human. I could tell that much from the way she looked. Her features were too sharp, too foreign. Her eyes, though they were closed now, had been the most striking. They weren't just the eyes of someone who had been through pain. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the worst of what the universe had to offer. Her gaze had been filled with something more than just fear. There was something deeper there, something ancient, something as if her soul had known suffering in ways I couldn't even imagine. But what could a creature like that want with humans? Why had she been abandoned out here, left to die in the blistering desert heat? The questions piled up in my mind, but no answers came, only more questions. I cursed under my breath, frustrated at the lack of clarity. I stood up abruptly, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. The fire crackled again, casting strange, dancing shadows across the sand. I needed to move, to do something, anything. I couldn't just sit here waiting for the answers to come. I looked back down at her, her fragile body lying in the sand, and a wave of protectiveness surged through me. I couldn't abandon her. I couldn't leave her to the desert or to the cruelty of whatever had done this to her. She needed me, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I needed to help her. She wasn't just some stranger. There was something about her, something in her that pulled at my heart, something that felt familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. With a deep breath, I moved back to her side. Gently, I lifted her up again, trying my best not to disturb her rest. Her body was limp, her weight like that of a child, yet there was an undeniable strength in her. It was as if she was waiting for the right moment to show it. I would be there when that moment came. I had to be. As I began to prepare for the journey ahead, I felt the weight of the situation press down on me. I couldn't rush this. I couldn't force answers from her. Whatever had happened to her, whatever had caused her pain, it was not something that could be solved overnight. I had to be patient, to take things one step at a time. The night passed slowly, each moment dragging by as I sat beside her, watching over her, the desert stretching endlessly around us. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind was too full of questions, too full of worry. I kept my eyes trained on her, making sure she didn't slip away in the night. The fire slowly burned down to embers, and I added more wood, stoking the flames to keep us warm. When the first light of dawn finally broke across the horizon, I knew it was time to move. The girl was still unconscious, but her breathing had deepened. It was a small sign of improvement, but it was enough to give me hope. I couldn't afford to waste any more time. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, and I had to be prepared for anything. With the first rays of the sun casting long shadows over the desert, I hoisted the girl up once more, carefully adjusting my grip. She was lighter than she looked, but the weight of the responsibility on my shoulders was heavier than anything I had ever carried before. It was strange how someone I had just met could make me feel so deeply responsible for their well-being. But it wasn't just responsibility, it was something more. It was a bond that felt like it had always existed, something that connected us in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. I began my journey, my footsteps slow and deliberate in the sand. The sun was already beginning to scorch the earth, but I pushed forward, focusing on the path ahead. The settlement wasn't far, but the desert was unforgiving. It would take everything I had to get her there safely. As I walked, my thoughts turned back to her. Who was she? Where had she come from? And most importantly, Who had done this to her? I had no answers, only more questions. But one thing was certain, I wouldn't stop until I had answers. I couldn't let this go, not after what I had seen. The desert was vast, but the more I walked, the more I felt an undeniable pull toward her, as if our fates were intertwined. And I would protect her, no matter what. Even if the world itself tried to stop me. She wasn't just some victim. She was someone who had endured unimaginable pain, and somehow I had become the one who could help her heal. And no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, I wasn't going to turn back. The desert stretched endlessly before me, but I didn't feel its emptiness anymore. I felt a strange sense of purpose, as if I were walking toward something greater than just survival. It was a journey, not just for her, but for both of us, and together we would find our way. The wind kicked up again, a fierce gust that seemed to sweep across the endless dunes, carrying with it the harsh scent of salt and earth. I shielded my eyes from the particles that stung like tiny needles, adjusting the girl's limp body in my arms. Her weight, though light, felt heavier with each step I took, the heat of the day pressing down on both of us. Every movement was a struggle, but I couldn't stop, not now. Not when I had already gone so far. It felt like hours had passed since I first began the journey, but it was probably only a few. The desert had a way of distorting time, of making minutes feel like days. With each step, my feet sank deeper into the soft sand, slowing me down further, making the trip feel even longer. I knew the settlement was nearby, but in this vast emptiness, it was hard to tell where the horizon ended and the world began. As I walked, I tried to focus on her, on the girl I had found in the desert, but my thoughts kept wandering. I thought of the life I had left behind, my quiet, solitary existence in a small town miles from here. I had never been a hero, never someone who sought out trouble or adventure, but now I couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of fate, if I was meant to find her, if this was the universe's way of telling me that I had a purpose. I adjusted my grip again, trying to keep her safe, to keep her from slipping from my arms. Her body felt so fragile, so delicate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I wasn't careful, if I made even the smallest mistake, I could lose her. I didn't even know her name, but it didn't matter. She had already imprinted herself on my soul. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I couldn't let anything happen to her. The girl shifted slightly in my arms, a faint groan escaping her lips. I paused, heart racing as I looked down at her. Her eyes were still closed, her face pale, but her breathing was more steady now, less shallow than before. She was alive. That was the most important thing. But for how long? I wasn't sure how. Much longer the desert would allow her to live. How much longer I could keep her going. The reality of our situation weighed heavily on me. Every second felt like a battle, against the heat, against the exhaustion, and against time itself, but I couldn't afford to dwell on the impossibilities. I had to stay focused, I had to keep moving, and yet, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, I couldn't help but wonder where she had come from. What kind of creature was she? Why had she been abandoned in such a brutal way? Her body had been marked by scars, some old and faded, others fresh, as if someone had deliberately tried to hurt her. The way she had been left in the desert, half naked, exposed to the elements, it didn't make sense. If she was some kind of alien, what could possibly make someone treat her like that? Were there others like her? What kind of world had she come from? I didn't know the answers to any of those questions, but I intended to find out. I had to. Not just for her sake, but for mine as well. There was something about this situation that felt like it was meant to be. Like this girl, this stranger, was the key to something bigger than either of us. As I trudged forward, my legs beginning to ache with each step, I caught sight of something in the distance. A flicker of movement, a shadow against the bright landscape. I squinted, trying to focus on it, but the desert's glare made it hard to see clearly. For a moment, I thought it was just another mirage, But then I saw it again. A small figure, moving slowly across the sand. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like someone coming toward me. My pulse quickened, my mind racing. Could it be another traveler, a person who could help? I took a few more steps, my legs burning with fatigue, and finally I saw it clearly. A man. He was dressed in heavy clothes, his face obscured by a scarf, his body hunched. Against the wind, he was carrying something small, bundled up in cloth. I couldn't make out what it was, but my instincts told me to be cautious. The man saw me at the same time, his eyes narrowing as he slowed his pace. I didn't know if he was a friend or a threat, but I wasn't about to let my guard down, not with her in my arms, not with everything that had already happened. "Hey!" I called out, my voice hoarse from the dry air. "Do you have any water?" The man didn't respond right away, his gaze flicking from me to the girl in my arms. He hesitated, then nodded slowly, his hand reaching into a pouch at his side. "Water's precious out here," he said, his voice low, rough. "But I've got enough for the two of you." I stepped forward cautiously, trying to read his expression. There was something guarded about him, something I didn't trust. But then again, in this desert, who could you trust? I had no choice but to accept his offer. "Please," I said, my voice pleading. "She needs it, we both do." The man handed me a canteen, and I took it gratefully, unscrewing the cap. I brought it to the girl's lips, gently tipping it so a few drops of water dripped into her mouth. Her lips barely moved, but her throat worked as she swallowed. It was a small sign of life, but it was enough to give me hope. The man watched silently as I tended to her. His face was still hidden beneath the scarf, but I could sense his curiosity, the questions he must have had. But he didn't ask any. Instead, he just stood there, his eyes scanning the horizon. I finally took a step back, handing the canteen back to him. "Thank you," I said, feeling the weight of the words. "You don't know what this means." He nodded, his gaze flicking over me once more, as if sizing me up. Then he turned his eyes toward the girl again, his expression softening slightly. "She's in bad shape," he said, his voice quieter now. "But she'll make it, if you can get her to shelter." "Do you know of a place?" I asked, desperate. "A settlement? A town?" The man didn't answer immediately. He looked around, his eyes scanning the empty desert. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "There's a place," he said finally. "A small village to the south. It's not far from here, but the journey's tough. Sandstorms, wild animals, you'll need to be prepared." I looked at him, trying to gauge whether he was offering genuine help or just playing some kind of game. But his tone was steady, and I had no other options. "How do I get there?" I asked. He pointed to the horizon, where the sun hung heavy in the sky. "Keep walking in that direction. You'll find a narrow pass through the dunes. It'll take you right to it." I nodded, though the idea of navigating those dunes with her in my arms seemed impossible. But it was my only choice. "Thank you," I said again, more urgently this time. "I'll find it. I'll get her there." The man didn't say anything more. Instead, he turned and began walking away, his figure fading into the distance. I watched him go for a moment, then shifted my focus back to the girl. Taking a deep breath, I resumed my journey. The sun was relentless, its heat searing through my clothes, but I didn't care. I had a purpose now. I had to get her to safety, and I would, no matter what. The journey had taken its toll. My body ached from the weight of the girl in my arms. My legs burned from the relentless sand, and my throat felt like it was lined with shards of glass from the dryness of the desert air. The sun was relentless, a fiery ball in the sky that seemed determined to burn everything in its path. But through it all, I refused to stop. She had suffered enough. I wouldn't let her suffer any more. The small village the stranger had pointed me toward finally came into view, a shadowy outline on the horizon. It felt like a dream, a distant hope that I had clung to as the desert tried to swallow us both whole. But now it was within reach. I could make it. I just had to keep going, Was barely able to take a step without stumbling, the weight of her growing heavier, but I kept moving. Each step was a prayer, a plea to whatever forces there were to let me get her there, to keep her alive long enough to get the help she so desperately needed. The village seemed quiet as I approached, its buildings made of simple stone and clay, designed to withstand the harsh desert winds. There were no roads, no clear paths, just a small cluster of structures built to blend into the landscape. It looked as though it had been there for centuries, untouched by the outside world. The villagers had probably learned to survive in this inhospitable land by keeping to themselves, by avoiding contact with strangers. But I wasn't a stranger, not anymore. The first person I saw was an older woman, hunched over with age, but with a sharpness in her eyes that seemed to see everything. She was working outside one of the buildings, sweeping the sand away from her doorstep, her movements slow but purposeful. When she saw me approaching, she stopped and squinted at me, her expression hardening. I wasn't sure what to expect. This village wasn't a place for outsiders, not for people like me, but I had no choice. I had to get the girl help. "Please," I said, my voice weak from exhaustion. "I need your help. She's in trouble." The woman studied me for a long moment, her eyes flicking from the girl in my arms to my face. She didn't speak for a while, just watched me, her gaze calculating. Finally, she sighed and gestured for me to follow her. "Inside," she said gruffly. "You're lucky to have made it this far. The desert doesn't give second chances." I didn't argue. I followed her into one of the small stone buildings, my legs nearly giving out beneath me as I crossed the threshold. It was cool inside, the thick walls offering a welcome respite from the brutal heat of the desert. The woman led me to a small cot in the corner of the room and motioned for me to lay the girl down. As I placed her gently onto the bed, I couldn't help but notice the way the woman's eyes softened as she saw the girl more clearly. She knelt beside her, her fingers moving with surprising gentleness as she checked the girl's pulse, her breathing, the damage to her body. "She's been through a lot," the woman said quietly, her voice suddenly soft. "Too much for someone so young." I nodded, my throat tight. I couldn't find the words to explain what I had seen, the scars, the bruises, the signs of abuse. Whoever had done this to her, whatever had done this to her, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that she was here now, safe. "Can you help her?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to a nearby shelf, pulling down a small jar filled with dried herbs and a few vials of what looked like oil. She opened one of the vials, smelling it briefly before turning back to the girl. "This will help her rest," the woman said, more to herself than to me. She dipped her fingers into the oil and gently rubbed it along the girl's temples, motions slow and careful. I watched, unsure of what she was doing, but trusting her hands. I had no choice but to trust her. "I need to ask you something," the woman said, her tone suddenly serious. "Where did you find her?" I hesitated, not sure how much I should reveal. I had my suspicions about the girl, about what she might be. But I didn't want to say the wrong thing. "I found her in the desert," I said after a long pause. "She was left there, hurt, abandoned." The woman's eyes hardened, her lips tightening into a thin line. "Abandoned? Who would do such a thing?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but I couldn't leave her there. She needed help." The woman nodded slowly, as if weighing my words. Then she stood up, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I'm going to prepare a place for you to rest. You'll need it. You've been through just as much as she has." I wanted to protest, to tell her that I wasn't the one who needed help, that the girl was the one who mattered. But the woman was already moving toward the door, her voice soft but firm. "You'll need your strength for what's to come." I didn't argue. Instead, I followed her to a small room at the back of the building, a simple cot set up for me. The woman left me with a bowl of water and a few strips of dried meat, then disappeared into the main room, leaving me with my thoughts. I collapsed onto the bed, my body aching from the journey, my mind spinning with questions I had no answers. The girl was safe for now, but how long would it last? What had happened to her? What kind of world had she come from, and who had done this to her? I tried to push the thoughts away, tried to focus on the fact that she was here, that she had made it this far. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the broken girl with the haunting eyes, her body marked by cruelty and pain. Whoever had hurt her was still out there, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. I had no idea what I had gotten myself into. Hours later, I woke to the sound of movement in the other room. The woman was talking to someone, her voice muffled, but the tone was familiar, almost comforting. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew she was taking care of the girl who had come from the desert, who had found her way into my life and changed everything. I stood, my legs trembling, and made my way to the door. The village was quiet, its inhabitants moving about their daily routines, all of them so different from the world I had left behind. They seemed so at peace, so unaffected by the harshness of the desert. But I couldn't forget the girl. I couldn't forget what had happened to her. When I entered the main room, the woman was sitting beside the girl, a small bowl of what looked like soup in her hands. The girl's eyes were open now, though she still looked weak, her face pale and drawn. The woman looked up at me as I entered, a slight nod of acknowledgement. "She's awake," she said, her voice soft. "She needs food and water, but she's strong. She'll survive." I nodded, relief flooding through me. She was alive. That was all that mattered. The girl's eyes flickered toward me, and for the first time since I had found her, she blinked, as if seeing me for the first time. Her gaze was clear, focused. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raspy from the desert's heat. "Thank you for saving me." I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, my throat tight. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was a part of my world now. "You don't have to thank me," I said quietly. "You're safe now." The girl's lips curved into a small smile, though it was fragile, as if it had been too long since she had been able to smile at all. "You're the first person to care," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The weight of her words hung in the air, and I felt a sharp pang in my chest. She had been through so much, and yet she was still standing, still fighting. "You won't have to face it alone," I promised, my voice steady. "I'll help you, whatever you need." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment there was no desert, no pain, no harsh world. There was just the two of us, two souls bound by the struggle to survive, to heal. The village outside would give us time. It would give us peace. And with it, we would find the answers we were both searching for, together.